I think to get at the question of what human intentionality is, I think if brain states are correlated with intentions, and we can show that, then we have a way to argue for a certain kind of human freedom. Right now, neuroscience tells us that that we are determined, that it's all about the brain that's doing the work in the world. There's really no intentionality, there's no freedom of the person, him or herself, to actually carry out an action. And it's all the neurons that are doing it. And I think what's really interesting about this sort of conference and this sort of research program that's being launched here is that we can reconsider that question and actually open this whole field of research up again and say it has not been resolved, free will has not been disproven. In fact, maybe there's still a possibility left that science in the future can show us that there is a role for consciousness, for agency in the act of acting in the world. And I think this is the biggest promise, for this particular field.
Well, I guess one promise is just to get clarity for these perennial questions, because these are, there's the traditional question of free will in a deterministic physical world, and related issues. And I think now the hope is that somehow we could understand maybe the relation of cognitive, mental, conscious phenomena and the underlying neural phenomena. And when we're doing that, we're also trying to clarify many of the concepts. What do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by will? And how do these connect with all the kind of things, intentions and various other things that we can also look from the neuroscientific point of view?
So the biggest promise, I think, is that it might enable us to make people more free. So it might enable us to identify deficits in freedom, may enable us to understand ways in which human beings aren't as free as we could be. So it might enable us to exacerbate or develop our freedom in new and interesting ways.
I think free will is not a single notion. I think it's a whole array of different notions. And I think we've tried to tease those apart philosophically, and I think we've tried to tease them apart with psychology, and I think now neuroscience is going to come in and help us complete that picture.
So I think this is one of the most exciting and fundamental challenges of all time. And I think that if we can understand the neural mechanisms by which the brain orchestrates volition and free will, this will have a tremendous impact on our legal system, on our social interactions, on clinical conditions such as addiction and other disorders of volition and free will, and also on how we think about ourselves, and even in artificial intelligence and how to design robots and sentient systems who are morally responsible.
To me, it's a great area that brings together our scientific attempts to understand the world and a more humanistic vision, and in particular our understanding of ourselves. So
that's a question I'm not going to answer because I'm a philosopher rather than a neuroscientist, so I don't know what the biggest promise is of the neuroscience of free will.
So the biggest promise in my mind is to get some sense of consciousness. Consciousness is the sort of leading question almost in neuroscience at the moment. It's not understood at all. And I think the study of free will might be a channel into the understanding of consciousness, which I think would be very valuable. And of course, the understanding of free will itself is valuable as relevant for neurological patients, for issues of responsibility. There's lots of things that the understanding of free will itself will be helpful for.
I think the biggest promise is based on the idea that free will is really the ability to act freely, and so whatever light neuroscientists can shed on action that is how actions are produced, will ultimately help us understand free will.
The biggest promise of the neuroscience of free will is that we can start to bring in contact our age-old philosophical thinking about free will with interesting experimental data. So while I don't think it's the case that neuroscience will just be able to answer the question of whether we have free will or not, because very often neuroscientists are like all normal people, lay people about the questions of what philosophical concepts of free will are. But what they can do is, philosophers didn't have the experimental data when they started theorizing for 2,000 years, and using this experimental data makes a difference to the answers that we want to give to these questions. So it's a bit like a reflective equilibrium. We can the data can change our intuitions, and then we can use our intuitions for a philosophical conceptualizing, and that again in context can make for better neuroscience, and the neuroscience can change better intuitions and so on.
Well, I think the biggest promise is that we might be able to figure out whether or not people have anything like the kinds of capacities for control over their behavior that we ordinarily think we have and that we presuppose that we have when we make judgments of responsibility.
So I think one of the big promises is the fact that we now try to collaborate or to form a platform in which philosophers and neuroscientists could work together and find new ways to answer one of the most intriguing questions in the history of thought, which is basically, are human beings free? And if we are, what does that mean? And how can we examine that scientifically or empirically? So to me, the most exciting thing is that we are trying to stop and ask this question in separate ways in different disciplines, but we are trying to collaborate and find a way to do it together as a community that is not limited to one line of research or a typical discipline, but actually trying to work together in collaboration along these lines.
I think the biggest promise is the bringing of the data discovered by scientists into the field where the problems have been discussed very abstractly before. These problems that to philosophers have been completely divorced from the actual structure and functioning of the brain are now actually being addressed in ways that take account facts that have been discovered by scientific inquiry about the structure and functioning of the brain. And therefore, these discussions by philosophers and neuroscientists actually have some content now. I mean, it's very difficult to answer this question because the answer is so obvious. So I've just given you this extremely obvious answer, and I'm sorry, but this extremely obvious thing to say is the only thing I have to say.
Well, the biggest promise would, of course, be if we could determine whether we have a free will or not. But maybe we won't be able to say definitely or give a definite answer within this rather short period. But we might at least challenge the common view that free will is an illusion. I think this is a big promise for this project, to give a more nuanced view on the problem of free will.
I think the biggest promise of neuroscience of free will is to move beyond the behaviorist tradition, which really dominated mind sciences and also brain sciences in the 20th century, which treated our behavior as being merely a result of the external environment in which we found ourselves. And it seemed as though having a mind or having a brain really added very little to our basic reflex responding under that framework. So the real excitement of a neuroscience of free will at the moment is to understand what it is that our minds supply for our behavior. We're not merely reflex organisms. And that's a new perspective in mind sciences, and I think it's an exciting one.
I think the group that's working on the neuroscience of free will is sometimes working on free will, but the real promise lies in understanding the relationship between minds and brains. This has baffled people for a long time. And if we can figure out how our mental states, our choices, our desires, our feelings, our beliefs are instantiated in the brain, we'll have made big progress on that. And the second thing is to understand how those mental states might cause the physical states. How does my choice cause my hand to move? That's a big mystery, and I think neuroscience can help.
Conceptual clarity, I think, is one thing that we're lacking a bit, especially in neuroscience. So we don't agree on what free will is. I think by working together with philosophers, we'll have a better idea conceptually of what free will is, and that will make it more feasible for us to actually do experiments.
I think that this field is interesting because free will has been opined upon, researched, been a substrate of scholarship for philosophers for millennia. And then about 35 years ago, neuroscientists joined the debate. And I think initially neuroscientists thought that they can just, they're going to figure it out experimentally really quickly. They're going to do one nice experiment and it's going to be done, and we're going to be all good, and then we're going to figure out if we have free will or not, roughly speaking. And I think that as neuroscientists, philosophers have started talking to each other a bit more, neuroscientists have figured out that the answer is more, or the question of do we have free will, is much more complex. It's not something we can answer just in one fell swoop. We will need more. It's very nuanced, it's complex, and that they would need the help of philosophers to make progress. And I think philosophers have understood that neuroscientists have something to contribute to the debate that they've been involved in for millennia. So I think the promise of this joint work between philosophers and neuroscientists is progress on the question. Not necessarily an answer, yes, we have free will, no, we don't have free will. I'm not even sure that it's such a binary answer as possible. I think that we will be able to answer sub-questions within this debate. For instance, say more about to what extent our brain enables conscious control of our decisions and actions. We might be able to say more about arbitrary versus deliberate decisions and things of that nature. And I think, at least at this point, that that is the promise of the field of neuroscience of free will, or neurophil of free will.
I think that many people in the scientific community, especially neuroscientists, basically will say that since the Libet type experiments in the 1980s, that this question has been resolved. That actually, we know that the brain is acting, and there is no other sort of causal power independent of the physical world that's performing this action. And I think there's if you read the textbooks, that's really the attitude in general. And so I think what's happening here is to kind of get about challenging that basic assumption, in the field, and opening up completely new possibilities of reconsidering, what was learned so far.
Well, I guess one promise is just to get clarity for these perennial questions, because these are, there's the traditional question of free will in a deterministic physical world, and related issues, and I think now the hope is that somehow we could understand maybe the relation of cognitive, mental, conscious phenomena and the underlying neural phenomena. And when we're doing that, we're also trying to clarify many of the concepts. What do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by will? and how do these connect with all the kind of things, intentions and various other things that we can also look from the neuroscientific point of view.
So I think there are two real central challenges. One is so many different conceptions of free will. That's obviously a problem. The other problem is understanding mapping relations between personal level descriptions of agents in terms of intentions, in terms of emotions, goals, feelings of agency on the one hand. So mapping between that level of description and a neural level of description. These are very different languages. And to really understand how freedom emerges from neural activity, you need some way to map between them, and that's a serious challenge.
So there are obviously two sorts of challenges, I think. One is the obvious experimental challenge to try and get a grip experimentally on how to test the notions there. But I think there's also a great deal of conceptual work that needs to be done first. I think you're not going to just read free will off from the brain. So I think that working out how to couch the difficulties is one of the major issues for free will.
One of the big problems in our field is our intuitions that sometimes get in the way, as well as many of our dogmatic views about the problem. Some of the answers about volition may be uncomfortable. It may be hard for us to accept that we're nothing but a pack of neurons, that our volition is purely and completely dictated by physical phenomena and by neuronal interactions, in the same way that people were extremely uncomfortable about thinking that the Earth went around the sun rather than the other way around. So our internal beliefs, our internal dogmas, and how to challenge them is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we have now.
The greatest challenge is that we need to resist the temptation to oversimplify. Neuroscience has made a lot of strides in the past several decades, but there are still vast amounts that are not understood, and so there's always going to be a temptation for theorists in trying to understand and model the human brain to either downplay or deny altogether the reality of that which they can't readily fit within current models of thinking. So I think it's in a field that requires a lot of patience, because I think we do understand a lot about ourselves from simple reflection on our own experience of acting and how to fit that together with the kinds of models that neuroscience seeks to deliver of mechanisms that implement the things that we experience. It's going to take a while before we have a satisfying way of even understanding how to bring those two together.
So the greatest challenge really is the understanding of consciousness. I don't think people have much idea about it at all at the moment. We don't have any good scientific way of understanding exactly what's happening. So that in order to understand free will being an aspect of consciousness in my view, it makes it difficult. There obviously are ways that we can study it. In my view, again, it's a brain state, and we should be able to understand brain states. But exactly how the brain state translates into something that we can be aware of is a very difficult matter.
I think the greatest challenges are probably deciding exactly what we want to test, what theses or propositions we want to test, and then how to test them. So decision about what we want to learn, and then decisions about how to learn it.
Well, it's a translation problem between two different fields. There are already very many problems if you want to speak between different empirical sciences, and obviously philosophy and neuroscience have very, very different traditions, very different vocabularies, and they often do not translate into each other. There's also clearly simply people are quite sensitive to being told by people in other disciplines that they're doing something wrong, they react even more hostile to criticism than they would to colleagues in their own field. And that makes discussions between disciplines very difficult.
The biggest challenge is probably communication between neuroscientists and philosophers. Neuroscientists tackle these problems largely by thinking about what they can measure, and they want to set aside discussion of qualities and properties of people that they can't measure, that they have no idea how to measure, where philosophers think very openly and freely about what kinds of properties people ordinarily think their actions have, and they don't worry about whether or not those are properties that they can measure. So trying to kind of translate and find common ground, turning philosophical concepts into ones that are actually operationalizable, is very difficult and a major challenge for the field, I think.
So I think a huge challenge is to understand the question. So this is a question that has been circling in different circles and wearing different types of forms, depending on who's been asking the question and how he or she has been asking it. And I think one of the biggest challenges is to understand the terms that we are using and to make the questions that we are asking as accurate as possible and as informative as possible. And I think what we need to do as a first step is to formalize our questions and find the best way to ask them, and that, in my opinion, or this is at least my hope, would allow us to do better science and better philosophy.
It's very difficult to make any sense when you talk about free will. There are challenges that have to do with concepts that are not well defined, in which people who talk about them, and this happens with both scientists and philosophers, people who talk in terms of these concepts don't really understand that the terms that they're using don't have any clear meaning. And I should say this this is my own personal opinion. Not everybody who's an expert in this area will agree with me on that. For example, I don't think anybody has any very clear sense of what they mean by the term free will. I don't think that anybody has any very clear sense of what they mean by the term conscious volition. There are all sorts of terms that are thrown back and forth by people discussing this problem as if they understood them, and I think they do think they understand them, and I don't think that the terms really mean much. They're not technical terms from the sciences. They're not ordinary terms from everyday life. They're just terms that are sort of in the air. And I think getting clear definitions, precise renderings of these terms, that is the single biggest challenge that faces the field.
I think it is to link the different levels of understanding from what happens at the neuronal level to the network level and to the mental level. So to link the different levels of brain, mind aspects, phenomena, and see the interaction between the different levels, not only from bottom up, but also, and more particularly, the top down. I mean, how can mental processes affect material, neural processes? I think this is a big and probably the biggest challenge.
I think the biggest problem in trying to study the neuroscience of free will is we can't use our conventional scientific methods. So normally in science, when you want to study something, you treat the thing that you're studying as a black box, and you manipulate the inputs and you measure the outputs. And the whole idea about, quote, free will, unquote, is that our actions are up to us. They're not driven by any external input. They're not driven by the environment. So what that means is that you don't have an input that you can easily manipulate. And that means that you can't use the standard method of studying the mind as a black box. So we lack good methods for understanding how volition. I'm not sure I like the term free will, but how volition works. And I think the biggest challenge right now is coming up with convincing and rigorous scientific methods.
I think one big challenge is just getting neuroscientists and philosophers together. They often mean totally different things by intention or by belief or by action. And sometimes they're just talking past each other. And that's a real challenge. More substantively, I think the biggest challenge is to try to get equipment that will reach all the different parameters at the same time. You need fMRI with its spatial location. You need EEG with its temporal location to be able to get the precision on the timing and the spatial location to understand what's going on. And I think it's a real challenge to get those together and make them work, in a single experiment.
Ditto. Conceptual clarity. So being able to define operationally what is free will, so that we can study it empirically.
About to what extent our brain enables conscious control of our decisions and actions. We might be able to say more about arbitrary versus deliberate decisions and things of that nature. And I think, at least at this point, that is the promise of the field of neuroscience of free will, or neurophil of free will.
What are the greatest challenges that you think this field faces?
So this field, some of the potential for success is also potential for challenges. This field, as I said, incorporates both philosophers and neuroscientists trying to work together. These are different disciplines with different ways of talking, thinking, having conferences, and so on. Neuroscientists typically have an experiment, and they argue about what is the right experiment to do and what is the interpretation and so on. Philosophers typically have great suggestions for perhaps experiments or for how to understand the question and so on. They have less knowledge about how to run experiments and things of that nature, how to control them properly from an empirical standpoint. So it could easily be the case that the philosophers, for instance, could get frustrated while they're waiting for months without end on the neuroscientists to come back with some data from their experiment. That's one thing. It could be that the philosophers and the neuroscientists don't really talk to each other. They kind of talk above each other in different levels, and we don't really get a dialogue going. It could be that it becomes just a shouting match about no, you don't respect data, no, you don't respect what the concepts are, rather than trying to really work together, because it's hard. These are different disciplines. It takes a lot of time and effort for people from different disciplines to really work together.
That's a really difficult question. I think many people would say it might be, that question might be by definition beyond empirical experimentation. That's why many people believe the notion of free will really is a philosophical concept only, and all the proposals I've heard so far on how to empirically investigate the notion of free will are not really very convincing yet. So I think this is an essential question to be asked, in this research program, whether actually any progress can be made exactly on that question. Because right now, I think all the experimental proposals on free will are more proposals about trying to find correlations for intentionality in the brain. But even if you find those correlations in the brain, does that mean we have really advanced on the question of free will? And I think that's a totally open question, whether this can be done.
Well, I think we're going to see in this conference, we're going to see many examples of that. But of course, I think first it means to get clear on what is meant by the free will, and there are many different definitions are being given. And some of the early experiments that Libet did back in 1983, then people were asked to do something like move their hand when they kind of felt like this. And of course, later on, people have criticized, well, that's not really what we in ordinarily, like common sense, mean by free will. Sometimes, if we are making important decisions in our lives and, those kinds of big things, it's very different from the kinds of maybe contrived situations we sometimes do with experimental studies. So I think if we can study more, do experiments where people are more real life situations, this would be an advance.
So one way to probe it, I mean, there are many ways, but one way to probe it is to look at disorders of volition, where people seem to be performing voluntary actions, seem to have some intentional control over their behavior, but feel as though they don't. So the feeling of agency is in some way disturbed, some way undermined, some way impaired. And to understand what's going on in the brain, what's going on in cognitive structures, such that there's this dissociation between volitional control and the feeling of volitional control.
That's not an easy question. I think that, as I said earlier, there are a lot of different themes that come in with free will. There are themes from moral responsibility at one end through to motor skills and the experience of agency from motor skills. So I think that breaking those issues down in such a way as to make them experimentally tractable is not a straightforward thing to do. So I think it has to be done step by step, and I think that's always with these things. It's something where you have some results that you think might bear on something, and then you work back again. So it's a sort of process of triangulation, I think, between philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, to come up with the right ways of addressing the questions.
So I'm very excited about the possibility of interrogating the neuronal mechanisms by which free will is orchestrated in brain circuits. An example of these that was quite influential is the Libet type of paradigm. And although there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of criticism about the experimental paradigm, about the implications of the results, about the interpretation of what that means, I think that that's an example as to how we can begin to jointly design adequate experiments, and we can begin to probe the neuronal mechanisms both in animal models as well as in the human brain to try to correlate and eventually find causal relationships between neural activity and intentions, volition, and the process of decision making.
That's a challenging question. And I think it's to make fruitful experimental exploration, it's got to be broken down into a lot of smaller questions of using our intuitive understanding of what it would be to act freely to guide what experimenters in beginning to try to look for processes, mechanisms that might suggestively point in the direction, either pro or con, our understanding of ourselves. So I don't think we're at a point right now where we can just take the big concept of free will and say, all right, let's run an experiment or a series of experiments that can either directly confirm or disconfirm the reality of this. Too much is not well understood for that to be possible. So it has to be, we have to go small and piecemeal. And I think that's easier for neuroscientists who are used to trying to break down complicated problems into smaller, tractable, empirically tractable problems than for philosophers who typically want to always keep our eye firmly on the big picture.
That's a great question. It seems to me we need to think hard about what we mean by free will. And so Uri's suggestion was that maybe there are requirements on it that then could be studied experimentally. Maybe that will work. But that seems like another hard question. I will have answers eventually.
So the idea of free will must in some way be embedded in the brain, and we have a lot of good tools now for studying the brain. We can do EEG studies. We can do fMRI studies. There are a whole variety of ways that we can get some sense about how the brain is actually processing things that will in fact relate to free will. So I think that is an aspect which makes it more tractable to understand than perhaps some other features of consciousness.
Well, you can bring free will down to earth. So imagine you think it's the ability to act freely, and then imagine that you had some definition of free action. And if you had a definition of free action of a certain kind, you could figure out a way to test whether we ever do that kind of thing, whether we act freely. There are different ways of conceiving of free action. Some are relatively simple. They don't require more than being well-informed and sane and making a reasonable decision on the basis of good information. It's easy enough to see that actually happens. It gets harder the more you add to the mix required for free action. But we'll see how that goes.
Well, directly I don't think it can be. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done, careful conceptual work, before we can start to design sensible experiments that tell us something about the nature of free will. So it is a philosopher's job to give us a clue about what we think we should mean by free will, or which aspects of free will we might be testing. And then once we break down the concept of free will into concepts like intentions, conscious control, different types of intentions, then we can start designing experiments that can test these concepts, which are already a lot closer to the neuroscientific world. So we need to translate a concept which doesn't only exist in the philosophy of mind world, but is obviously a moral philosophy concept as well, into a concept that sits more squarely in the philosophy of mind context, and a testable concept, and then we can start making experimental, design good experiments in order to make progress with the more abstract notion.
So, I mean, I think there's a million ways to go after it, and I don't think it's actually harder than other abstract notions that we probe experimentally all the time. So, belief is an abstract notion, but we probe it experimentally. Many examples, and so pretty much wherever you have a psychological concept, there's a question as to you're dealing with something fairly abstract, and then the question is how to go about examining it in an experimental setting. So I think there's tons of ways of going about it. There's too many ways to list in the same way as for any other kind of highly abstract notion.
So I think this is indeed one of the greatest challenges, how to take this concept or this term and try to break it into smaller questions, and how to formalize it in empirical ways. What we try to do in our work is to focus on deliberate or meaningful decisions, so not decisions that are completely random or arbitrary and have little bearing on what we do in everyday lives. So we try to examine the question of volition by focusing on typical decisions that you might have made, in a typical day, trying to ask where in that process volition comes into play.
Well, it's difficult when you don't know, as I've suggested, what free will is. But there are questions about free will and determinism that can certainly be probed experimentally. For example, the more you can predict human behavior, from physical antecedent conditions, the better the evidence is that human actions are determined. Or if you can actually conduct experiments that show what the Libet experiments claimed to show, that there are antecedents of human actions that are purely physical, that are not susceptible of conscious introspection, and that these occur well before a conscious decision to act, that tells us a lot that's relevant to questions of voluntary control of action. So a lot of empirical data can be collected. It's certainly relevant to the problem of free will. The problem is finding ways to make it clear what its relevance is.
Well, I think that first we have to find a sort of a neural correlate of free will or conscious free will. And that is, if we can find some way to link our sense of free will with some neural correlate, like synchronous oscillations, which I think is a good candidate, then we can make experiments that measure how the neural activity changes depending on our experience of free will and when we exercise free will.
So I think the biggest challenge in trying to produce experimental studies of free will is trying to combine in a single experiment all the different things that people want out of a theory of volition and a theory of free will. So in philosophy, for example, people always say, oh, voluntary actions are the actions that you make for a reason. So we need to have a reason why somebody would make a movement or make an action during an experiment. And in neurophysiology, we say that the critical thing about a voluntary action is the particular brain circuits that trigger the muscle contraction that make us move. And I think one of the real difficulties for producing experiments is getting all of these different elements which seem to contribute to what we mean by volition into a single experiment. All we can do at the moment is design an experiment which addresses some of what we mean by free will, but perhaps not everything.
Well, that's hard, of course, because it's so abstract, as you say. It actually means different things. If we want to understand what causes wills, then we have to get causal relations. That means we have to manipulate things. If we want to figure out what causes what, we need to manipulate the cause and see if the effect changes at the same time. So now that means we need to be able to manipulate consciousness. We need to be able to manipulate beliefs. We need to be able to manipulate desires and hopes and dreams when you start talking about big actions. And so that's, really difficult to do, to change people's beliefs, desires, consciousness in an experimental setting.
That's tricky. Pass.
Okay. Well, the notion of free will has been probed experimentally since the Libet experiment and perhaps before. However, how to do it correctly is difficult because of the things I mentioned before. This is a complex field, it's very nuanced. I think the right way to go about this is to really try to make sure that the concepts that we're studying are the concepts that make sense to study. The kind of experiments that we're doing are not just well controlled, but they're also asking the right question, that if we get a specific answer to that question, it would not just convince neuroscientists, but actually convince philosophers that we have made some progress in the field. I mean, I'll give you an example of something that we have done. One question that keeps on coming up for us was, well, in the Libet experiment, you could perhaps predict whether a person is going to go like this or go like that, but in some sense, who cares? You're just sitting there and you're saying, raise one of your hands. So I can predict which hand you're going to raise from your brain activity. So what? A more important question, in our opinion, is, can I predict that when these movements are meaningful. Raise your right hand if you want to donate to charity A. Raise your left hand if you want to donate to charity B. Something like that. Now your movements are meaningful. There's reason behind them, and so on. And this kind of experiment, we reached this experiment after a lot of debates with philosophers. So we now think that the result that we would get from an experiment like that would be of value not just to neuroscientists but to philosophers as well. And I think that's the kind of experiments that we would need to make progress in the field.
I think this is one of the most innovative aspects of this program because scientists, including neuroscientists, they need to get guidance on the use of terms, concepts, ideas, and philosophers are particularly well trained in defining terms, in defining distinctions, and in really making the case for or against based on logic on certain types of arguments. And scientists, especially empirical scientists, are really not trained to do so. So I think the interaction between neuroscientists and philosophers, in particular on the question of free will, is absolutely crucial to have any hope for making an advance in the future.
Well, I think in this case, both fields can really benefit from this enterprise. I think maybe what philosophers tend to do, they give great attention to concepts and how the same concept can be used in many different ways. So I think the philosopher's task is to really be very sensitive to the way, are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about the different things? And of course, then when we go and do the experiments, then there again, what is it actually? What are we actually studying experimentally here? But on the other direction, I think also neuroscientists can often provide very interesting data that would challenge some philosophical theories, and often in some ways the most interesting research combines them both, and you could neuroscientists could come up with some data that kind of even contradicts some philosophical theories. So those are always good opportunities for progress.
Well, let me start with the challenges. The challenges is we have different training. We often understand, we often use the same words, but we use them in different ways. We understand different things by them. And we come at things from different perspectives. So that's a challenge. In a sense, that's also an opportunity because we can see things, each side will see things that the others don't see. I think philosophers have a special appreciation for the links or the nuance of our everyday way of thinking about free will and the legal, moral, political ramifications of that that neuroscientists don't always have. The neuroscientists, of course, understand the mechanics of human agency and human action. They're in a position to understand how the machinery works and what impact probing and intervening on this part of the machinery is going to have on human behavior.
I mean, the advantages are obvious that you can really start to look at the mechanisms that are there. And I think sometimes we find when we look for the mechanisms that they're actually completely unlike we thought. So we're just wrong about how human beings work. I'd be surprised if that happens in the case of free will, but I think it's an open question. I think it may be. So the great advantages, the great success you might have is when you realize that something you had thought might be real turns out to be real in a very specific way. So I think we're looking at, as I said, to give some examples of that, issues around the perception, the phenomenology of freedom, what it feels like to be doing something free. I'm not sure philosophers have ever had a very good idea of that. There's some vague thought behind it. And I think that's something where the neuroscience might really help us find out about it.
I'm very, very excited about the possibility of interacting with philosophers. I'm a physicist turned neuroscientist. There are about 5 decades that I need to catch up with in terms of understanding neuroscience. And there are 5 centuries, if not 5 millennia, of the history of philosophy. So I think that collaborating and working alongside with philosophers is very important. Philosophers have a way of posing the right questions, of helping us find logical flaws in our thinking, helping us interpret the results, and sort of correcting us when we're over-interpreting the results of our experiments. So I think that this synergistic collaboration between neuroscientists and philosophers is particularly important. There are lots of challenges ahead as well. So one of them is the type of jargon that we use that sometimes is difficult. It's very hard to keep up with advances in philosophy and in neuroscience at the same time. And again, sometimes we come to the question with our own preconceived ideas of how things work. We have our own internal religion or dogma about how things work. And I think moving us, both philosophers as well as neuroscientists, moving us away from those preconceived notions and those intuitions is extremely challenging. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers to progress right now.
Well, the advantage is neuroscientists are sort of at the bottom level of the study of human behavior. That's about the kind of deepest level science that directly impinges on human action, and then on up through more cognitive psychological sciences. And then philosophers are at the most general and abstract. They're just reflecting, or at least they start from simply reflecting on our ordinary experience of ourselves as beers and doers in the world. And so the advantage of bringing both philosophers and neuroscientists into conversation with one another is that each can discipline the other. I think philosophers can bring to the table an understanding of the richness of the phenomena, so to help keep neuroscientists from oversimplification of what it is that they're trying to study, and neuroscientists bring a kind of hard physical science discipline to the study of these questions. So it's fruitful because there's tension, and both sides are pushing the other to see the limits of the methodological approaches that they are used to.
So I think the advantages are great. I mean, I think that we're both trying to study something that is important to people and that is worth studying in both ways, both philosophically and experimentally. The challenge, I think, is in was twofold at least, probably more. One, which I thought was evident from today's session, is getting people to use the same terms to mean the same things. So today we heard people talking about intentions as forward-looking, but agency as backward-looking. That was a thing that one of the experimenters said. That's a completely new use of those terms to me. And there's a couple other things that even just being on the same page and understanding one another seems like a challenge. And then trying to identify the question that we're going to be experimentally probing. That was actually your second question, or that would have been my answer to your second question. What are the greatest challenges the field faces? I think it's probably identifying questions that can be pursued in a sustained and systematic way.
I think that this has been a terrific collaboration. Philosophers, in my experience, first of all, to make clear, I'm a neuroscientist on that side of the issue, but collaborating with philosophers, I think, is extremely valuable in terms of asking good questions. in order to understand a problem, you really have to explore it from a whole variety of directions. And philosophers have a way of thinking intensely about a particular issue and come up with very good questions about things and can help direct what the neuroscientists will be doing. In my own experience, I've already done certain experiments that I wouldn't have even thought of doing if I hadn't interacted with one of the philosophers here in this group.
Well, one of the advantages is really that you're able to do a division of labor. So good philosophers who know a lot about free will can help at that end of things, sort of the conceptual end of things, the history of the subject. And good neuroscientists who know a lot about neuroscience can help to design studies that can give us information about things we want to know. So I think the collaborative. Oh, there was a second part to the question? Yeah, and the challenges will be in working together, really just normal interpersonal challenges, like make sure you respect what the other person says, try to be clear in what you're saying, and so on. I don't think it's a special problem.
Well, I suppose that's a bit similar to the second question. So the advantages of working together are the ones that I suppose that what I said in answer to the first question is that both disciplines do not have the tools available of the other disciplines. So philosophers don't have the experimental data. They only work with concepts that are rooted in a folk psychological understanding of the world. That's what we start with. But what they do have is the careful conceptual analysis of these concepts, whereas empirical scientists, on the other hand, often do not have the time in their everyday life to think carefully about the nature of concepts, but they do generate data which are often very surprising, and the surprising data help the theorizing. So this is an advantage. Both disciplines have very different strengths and weaknesses, and they can complement each other in using the strengths and making the weaknesses slightly less prominent. At the same time, this creates lots of problems because it's very difficult to talk to each other because we have these different strengths and weaknesses. We don't have the same vocabularies, and that creates tensions and feelings of not being taken seriously. So I grew up as a philosopher, as it were. I did my PhD in a psychological institution, and my PhD advisor, a famous psychologist, he wrote a polemic about why he thought that philosophers and neuroscientists or cognitive scientists should go separate ways, because he felt so unfairly treated by the philosophers who didn't do any real experimental work, but who nevertheless felt like their views were so important that they had that they could criticize what people in the lab were doing, and yeah, trying to get over these, I think, often social elements is the most difficult part in the cooperation.
So I had training in both disciplines, so both philosophy and neuroscience, and so I see great value in collaborating between these two disciplines. I think that if one wants to study free will, one better know the philosophical debates and arguments around this issue. This is a specific topic where you want to collaborate with philosophers because of the major conceptual issues that are at play here. And for philosophers as well, I think that in this day and age, you can do philosophy of volition without knowing neuroscience, but that would limit your scope tremendously. So I think the greatest advantage is that both disciplines would improve themselves if they would interact with the other discipline. And I think our science would be better, and I think our philosophy would be better. The greatest challenge is to find the common language. So what should be the common currency in this type of discussion? how philosophers can speak with neuroscientists in a language that neuroscientists would understand, and how neuroscientists will do the same. So that means that we have to take the terms, the professional terms of each discipline, and find a way to translate them into the other field. I'm sure that we can do it, but I think this is the greatest challenge. And also, I spoke before about finding the right questions. So I think it would also be a challenge to define the questions in a way that is interdisciplinary. So philosophers have their own questions and scientists have another way of asking questions, and we need to find a new way to ask questions in a way that would be meaningful both for philosophy and for neuroscience.
Well, their educations are so awfully different. I mean, so I've heard people at the conference here stress ways in which they were similar, and there certainly are similarities, desires for clarity and rigor and close logical reasoning and so on. But if you're trained in the laboratory sciences, and if you're trained in a purely theoretical discipline like philosophy, your whole, I think, approach to problems can be extremely different. There has to be some way for people on the purely theoretical side and on the laboratory side to cross this gulf. Happily, the most neuroscientists are not purely experimentalists. Some of them have deep theoretical interests too, and it's in this area where they have the theoretical interests that I think there's the possibility of the closest collaboration between scientists and philosophers. I should say too, many philosophers have deep interest in the theoretical, in the empirical discoveries about the brain that I mentioned in my answer to the first question.
The advantages are that we can understand each other from the different points of view, so different backgrounds, and make, for example, the philosophers can help the scientists to define their concepts better and keep to the relate to traditional ways of using the concepts in free will issues and consciousness and so forth. Intention and desires, etc. All these kind of words that philosophers have been working with for a long time can perhaps be better communicated with the scientist, how to use the words, and also to ask questions in a way that scientists perhaps are not so used to in the same way as philosophers are. And at the same time, the neuroscientist can inform the philosophers on what can be done and what is experimental approaches, what can they add to philosophical issues, and the link between reality and mind, if you like, is better. That's an advantage. A challenge is, of course, that we don't understand each other, that we use different languages, that we have coming from different traditions, and these traditions are like different cultures or different languages, and it's often a problem to have people coming from different language bases or cultures, scientific cultures or disciplines, to talk to each other and understand each other. Often you talk side by side, or you don't get through with your communication. So I think that the communication is a big challenge.
There, I think I'm just going to answer based on experience. So in my research group, I've had 3 young people who have had a good training in philosophy and have come to me after a PhD in philosophy and have said, I want to think about data, I want to think about doing experiments, I want to think about studying these problems not purely theoretically, but as they unfold in our behavior. And in all 3 cases, those are people who've joined my lab, who've learned some experimental methods, who've done their own research work, and have really taken on board the different methods and have learned a lot. And one of the main things that we've jointly learned in all 3 cases is that actually a good experiment is very similar to a conceptual analysis.
Well, I already mentioned the difficulty of getting them to talk to each other. So now I'll add another difficulty, and that is getting them to agree on the same standards. Neuroscientists say a paper's not good unless it has this and this and this and this and this. And the philosophers say, oh, no, no, no. For a paper to be good, it's got to have these other things, that and that and that and that and that. And so they need to agree on what's going to be a good paper, what's going to be a good experiment, or they're not going to both be invested in it and they're not going to be able to work together.
I think one of the biggest challenges is that we speak different languages. So I've had lots of great conversations with philosophers, but they always end up with lots of question asking in both directions. So what do you mean by that? I get asked, and what do you mean by that? I ask them. And it's sort of like we have these totally different vocabularies, and it can take a while to sort of get into that other person's world and understand what they mean, and then it's sort of illuminating. Then you see something from a different perspective, but it takes work. It takes effort, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
So I think I answered that question when I was answering the other questions. Advantages, you can get it more, the concepts would be more clearly defined, and the results that you would get would be considered valid by both philosophers and neuroscientists. The challenges is, again, getting along, being able to talk to each other rather than past each other, not getting frustrated by the fact that we speak different languages and so on.
I do. I from a philosophical point of view, I believe in the school of thought of compatibilism. Even though the world is deterministic, like endless cause-effects chains, I do believe that is not incompatible with the notion that a human being can have free will. And I think it will take a lot. This is not shared by many people, that point of view, but I personally see no disagreement between assuming that the world is physical and at the same time that my experience of having free will actually is a real experience, at least. And I think that's all we can say about free will right now.
Yes, that's my view. But then again, not necessarily in an absolute sense. I think we have free will up to a point, but there are of course all kinds of perhaps even our unconscious factors, desires, feelings, all kinds of things can determine the content of our will. So personally, I think if we really want to become more free, we have to, maybe through things like meditation, we have to really learn to become aware of even if you like, the deeper layers of the mind and kind of a self-knowledge. And in that sense, increase our degree of freedom of our will. And responsibility, of course, comes with it.
I think we have a certain kind of freedom. We're capable of voluntary action. Whether that's free will as some people conceive of it, probably not. Do we have free will as other people conceive of it? Yes. Do we have enough free will for moral practice, for legal institutions? Yeah, I would say we do.
I do, but as I say, it's a complex notion. And so I think there are conceptions of free will that we don't have, certain dualist conceptions. But I think we have something which is recognizably what we mean when we're not ordinarily talking about free will.
No, I don't. I'm a fierce reductionist. I don't think there's any such thing as free will. I think we're nothing but a pack of neurons. I think all of our volitional decisions will ultimately be able to explain. We'll be able to explain all of them based on neurons and their interactions. There's nothing that transcends the laws of physics. There's nothing that goes beyond the basics of scientific scrutiny.
Yes, of course we have free will. That is, I think we have free will, and I think we all believe that we have free will, although some skeptical theorists believe that, they disbelieve in free will. That is, one can have a sort of reflective second order belief, denying the reality of free will, but all of us, we're wired, if you like, to believe that we are free. And we could scarcely imagine, I think, inhabiting our social environment, our relationships with one another, without believing of ourselves and of other cognitively intact adult human beings, that much of what we do is under our control, such that we can be properly be held morally responsible for what we do. So I think that's just part of the human condition to understand ourselves in those terms, whether it's true or not.
I think it depends on what you mean by free will. I think there is a number of different things people mean by free will. Some of them, I think, ultimately are not coherent. So I think some of what some people think have in mind looks to me like something like a square circle, a kind of thing that there just couldn't be. Sometimes what people have in mind, I think, would require us to not be worldly. So I don't think, and I think we're worldly. So I don't think we have that kind of free will. But some of what people have in mind by free will has to do with whether we can affect changes in the world in accordance with our own plans, and also whether we're such that we could be morally responsible. And I think we have both of those often, not always. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but we often do.
As I have said a number of times, my view is that it depends upon the definition. Almost all of the issues that we talk about depend upon the definition that you want to use. Years ago, I must say, I used an internal definition for myself in which I felt that it didn't exist. But the definition that I now use, I think that I can accept that it exists. And to be specific in that regard, the definition that I'm using now is whether the brain is able to function freely without any coercion or significant process like a seizure that might interfere with its processing. So if the brain can function normally, then I believe that in that sense the brain is free, and the brain is free in relation to free will.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've written a lot of books and articles on free will, and what I usually do is give people two different options for what free will is. It's always going to be the ability to act freely, so the options are free action. Here's one set of sufficient conditions. A person is sane and rational, well-informed, makes a decision on the basis of good information in the absence of coercion, any monkey business like that. That would be sufficient for free action. On that conception of it, yes, I believe in free will. On another conception, you have to add to that mix indeterminism in the human brain, so that the laws that govern brain activity are not exceptionless, but rather just probabilistic. If that is what free will requires, then I think it's an open question whether we have it. I don't know whether we do or not, so I'm neutral on that.
We clearly have free will, but I think actually that particular question doesn't really require any neuroscientific input, because I do think that especially what has been meant by that question in the past is a question about the compatibility of free will and determinism, and we can sort that out on conceptual grounds. And I think, yeah, we can say in all confidence we have free will.
Do I think we have free will? Yes, I think we have free will.
I don't know. I prefer not to say yes or no to a question that I have no good answer to. I hope that in the course of our investigation I might have a better answer, but I think it heavily depends on how you define free will.
I don't think the question is well defined. As I said, there are numerous definitions of free will. I think in some sense it's, as some people have explained the term, no, we don't have free will, as others have explained the term, yes, we do. For example, if you mean by free will that when someone is trying to make a decision between two alternatives, that person is able to perform both of the alternatives. Yeah, in that sense, I think we have free will. If you mean that there's some magical power to contravene the laws of nature, no, I don't think we have free will in that sense.
I think we have free will. I think it's hard to understand how we could not have free will. I mean, I think that there's nothing in science that I would say is evidence enough to say that free will cannot exist. I mean, our notion that free will cannot exist is often based on the idea that physics says that the world is deterministic, or we have only determinism and chance, randomness, as the only ways of explaining the world. But we have sort of neglected the possibility that there is something else as an explanatory, has an explanatory power. So I think that free will is a precondition for being a human, and it's very much linked to consciousness. I think consciousness and free will go together, and you cannot really separate those two.
So I think we have something. I want to understand what it is that we have. I think our actions are not merely reflexes triggered by the immediate sensory input, or at least not all our actions are like that. So I want to understand where those non-reflexive actions come from. Whether you then want to call them, quote, free will, unquote, that would be up to you. I think I probably would not use that term until I had to. But I think that studying what it is that makes our actions flexible and expressive and interesting is a pretty important scientific enterprise.
Well, that depends on what you mean by free will. I'm a philosopher, I've got to say that. So I think if free means free from causation, then no, I don't think we have free will, because none of our acts are free from causation. All of our acts are in fact caused. But if free means free from constraint, I get to do what I want to do, then we do have freedom in that sense. And so if you ask me, do we have free will or not, I got to ask you, what exactly do you mean by that? And then I can answer your question. But if you ask it in general, we're going to get nowhere.
I believe that we have free will. But if you ask me what I think, I'm not sure.
That's, of course, a difficult question. I think it depends on the definition of free will. If personally, I cannot see how we have some kind of very libertarian free will, where whenever there's a decision, the world stops, you step out of the world, you think about it, you make a decision, then the world continues and you move on. But I also do think that our conscious thoughts, wants, deliberations, decisions, and so on do affect our actions. So to that respect, I do think that we do have conscious control over our actions. In that respect, I do think that we have free will. So it's, again, a nuanced answer to a nuanced question.